Willkommen to La Nouvelle Orleans. Well, as every month, nice to see all of you. Welcome. And you are?
Oh.
What's your name?
Ben Favre.
Okay, great. And why are you here?
He's in the wrong room.
Pat dragged me.
No, there's a reason for it. So tell us a little bit about why you're here.
Well, I'm a serial entrepreneur, and one of the things that I was involved in was historic restoration in the French Quarter. So, as I was explaining, well, not explaining that, Donald and I were discussing it. The federal government's definition of the French Quarter is from Canal Street to Esplanade, North Rampart to the river. But the city of New Orleans, the definition is from the middle of Iberville to Esplanade, and then from North Rampart, I believe it's to the river, it may be to the street just before the river. But in any case, we did, or I was involved, my partner and I were involved in historic restoration from in the city of New Orleans area, which is governed by the Historic District and Landmarks Commission, whereas the Bucare Commission is in charge of the French part of the city of New Orleans. And but my experience was that the executive director of the Historic District and Landmarks Commission, he wanted to be the executive director of the Bucare, so his interpretation of the rules and regulations were a little different. But one of the, I guess one of the interesting things, the most interesting thing, was the city of New Orleans' definition of a building is 3 walls. You don't need a roof, you just need 3 walls. And so we removed the building. We had 3 walls, and we, for whatever crazy reason, the architect decided that, and perhaps I'm taking a little bit of the underway, he decided that we
No, we got another hour.
need
before it starts.
30-foot pylons in a space that was 60 feet deep and 30 feet wide. So we had to bring in the power drivers and all the other stuff, and then of course you had to put sensors on all the buildings to make sure that those old buildings. And by the way, we were between the U.S. Custom House and Marriott, which was basically Decatur Street. Anyway, I forget his last name, but Larry, whatever, he was in charge of the historic district. And he walked by a building, and he said we didn't have a permit. Or a permit, we had forged his signature on our drawings. And so he put a stop work on it. Well, this went on for 9 months. In the meantime, we were blowing through money initially like crazy. So we had a loan at the bank and interest going on and all this other stuff. And finally one day, I was standing in this void area and I was looking, and one of the people who worked for us said, "You need to get this voodoo priest in here." I said, "There's a voodoo priest?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "His name's so-and-so, or priest so-and-so." And I said, "Okay, well, where is he?" "Well, he's down," he gave me an address. So I went down there and I contacted him. And I said, "I need you to take the spell off this place." He said, "Oh, I can do that." So I said, "How much are you going to charge me?" He says, "I'm charging you $200. I said, "Man, this is $200. Come on down." So I have a picture somewhere in my archive of him standing facing the wall, and he had put some paint on it, and he was in his headdress, and he had a spear, and he was mumbling all this stuff. Well, suffice it to say, 2 weeks later we got to stop work on the lift.
So welcome to the
That was
French
money
Quarter,
well
right? Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That is such a good story.
Yeah. So anyway, there's still green grease there to go want to get those. You never start a job without green. Do you know what green is in the old days?
Oh, yeah.
The green, the little pouches that if you want to work the voodoo on behalf of you, then you get the green. So the little dolls made out of clothing and filled with Spanish molds, and they have buttons for eyes and figurines.
How do you spell that?
Like Gris, Gris, repeated it. But it's really, they work. They're only $200, and especially when the Gris is the one that does it for you.
Wow.
That's behind it. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. I'll use the introduction to the French Quarter. The reason for putting this together is because it's really quite a nice, interesting story. And my postgraduate work that I did at York in Britain was on historic preservation when the whole thing was really, really starting. And I got the first degree on historic preservation in the whole Americas because I was the second generation of the course, and nobody from America had been there before. So that's why I know that I got the very first degree in preservation. And that is what really took me around the world, was historic preservation. Doors were open. If I had the money in my pocket, I would not have been able to go so many places and open so many doors. But dealing with culture, then it was a good passport to go around the world. And then eventually landed in New Orleans, and I pernocted in New Orleans for 24 years. So went back from Europe, it was Chicagoland, 4.5 years, but only 1.5 winters. I don't have to tell you why. I'm a hot-blooded mammal. I belong up there in those latitudes. And New York was very, very interesting because I lost my pigment. I was able to see my network of veins and arteries because there's no sunshine, or what sunshine those days, because it's quite north, and then you have the clouds meeting in that band of the planet, so the sun is kind of absent. And so it was a testing. What I missed the most was the sunshine. That was really, really hard. But after all that, I landed in New Orleans. I just said, enough is enough for Chicagoland, and I didn't have a job, and I just took a car and had a van and hitched my sailboat behind, and I said, I'm going to New Orleans, just like that. And he said, we always find jobs anywhere. So my sister was living in New Orleans, so now she has a sailboat in the backyard, and I'm hunting for a job, and the World Fair was about to start. So this is 1983, and I went for some interviews, and the firm which was doing the World Fair had an ad in the newspaper, looking for an architect with 2 degrees minimum 10 years of experience, and something to know about historic preservation. So I said, perfect, I'll go there. So they offered me, they offered me the job, and they had some good monies into it. And they said, well, the job for you is for the next 24 months, that's 2 years. You're going to do bathrooms elevations. New Orleans was prepared for the Great World's Fair, and so many hotels and so many mini hotels were being built or transformed, and they needed someone to draw by hand the elevations of the 4 walls of bathrooms. So I said, I have 3 degrees. I've been in Europe. I am not going to do bathrooms for you. I'm sorry. So I declined that one and found another one. And in time, this firm found me again, and we had a tremendous experience. That was Perez Architect, August Perez, Augie Perez. So it really turned to be a great experience, great friendship with him. And then one time there was this pretty lady in one of my classes at Tulane, and in one of the conversations to me there was Augie's daughter. But she was going by the husband's name, the last name, so I didn't know it was Augie's daughter. So I said, well, welcome, tell your father that now, the guy that used to be with you also is a professor at Tulane. So anyway, at Tulane I started a master in preservation studies dealing with this. School of Architecture was all about design, and all architecture was not architecture for the School of Architecture in Tulane. They didn't consider all buildings architecture. They were just all buildings. And there was no criteria. And most of the deans came from outside New Orleans. So they came with all this idea about why they were hired. And by the time New Orleans had finally paid the deans and understand New Orleans, it was time for them to go away. So here, new deans start the whole thing all over again. So one colleague was the interim, and we started the conversations, and that's where the Master in Historic Preservation turned. It's called the Master in Preservation Studies. So it's a comprehensive thing. And that was another connection again to many parts of the world, all again Latin America and the Caribbean, because Tulane is there everywhere. And that was my relationship with this. Coming from Europe, and especially living in Rome, and dealing with Rome, because that's where I went to teach historic preservation in Rome, during the construction sites, Rome and New Orleans are exactly the same. You know, one is bigger than the other, one is on the water, the other one is on the river, one is older than the other one, but for historic preservation it's very much the same. Because how do I learn that? The National Park Service, the government, in its infinite wisdom, they bought 2 houses on the French Quarter, and they're going to put there the National Park headquarters in New Orleans. So I was there because the superintendent of the work came to me at Tulane and they said, I think you need to see this building. He said, why? It's not comfortable. I'm not comfortable there. So went with him, and the TV has already done, the invitation for the grand opening has already been issued and distributed. The radio was contacted, the press was contacted in about 5 days. Everything was basically done except the carpet. There were rolls of carpet to be laid down everywhere. And then the guy took me and said, look. And I looked, and I said, there will be no opening. Oh no, it's impossible. I said, this building is going to collapse. So I said, how do you know that? You know, we have been working on it. You know, it's critical, but it's not bad. I said, yeah, it has not collapsed because nobody has been inside. The building has been empty because that's why you need to do renovation. You have an empty building. But once it gets loaded with people, and in the government there were 5 different safes, and there's a huge cast iron, safes and other paraphernalia. And at the time, the books was the technology, so nothing of that was in the building yet. So once all that load was going to be put in the building, it will have collapsed. So I had to explain, I prepared a writing, deal with it, and then I met with the structural engineer, and the government, in its infinite wisdom, hired the structural engineer from Denver, Colorado, to work in the mud hole called New Orleans. So the first thing he says is that, well, what are the codes? I said, what's that? Yeah, every place has codes. Well, which ones you asking me? The Romans or the one from the United States? Well, what do you mean? Well, this city wasn't built with U.S. codes. There was no United States when this city started with this building. Yeah, but we need codes. Well, you must be a structural engineer, so let me do something. Is that you have to drop the codes and find out how this thing was built. So he hired me to write a report and teach him how to envision the French Quarter and where the codes that were used. So back to the books, and when Jesus Christ was about 70 years dead, there was an architect in Rome, and he wrote a book about how to build, because the Roman Empire was extending, and he wrote a book, kind of standards for the Roman Empire to be everywhere in Europe. So I knew about it. I went and began to quote the book, that's the year 78 after Christ. Then in the 1600s, Palladio came across, and Vitruvius, Vignola, they wrote about how to build buildings, which were, they found the old Roman architect and they just translated to Italian and French. And I have those books and they're here, and began to look at them. Then presented this to the structural engineer, and he said, I had to hire you because I don't understand a word of what you were saying. He said, well, what do you mean? Well, you're talking about proportions. You know, I need scales, I need pounds. He said, sorry, but this was built in metrics, using tons instead of pounds and feet and inches, and dealing with proportions. You know, when this guy in the year 78 after Christ, when the building has 3 stories, the top wall has a certain thickness, and the wall that is below has to grow about 2/3, so the load can be transmitted, and you have a ledge to be able to sit your floor. When you get to the first floor, then you go, the relationship is 2/3 more, and then you have a ledge for the floor. And by the time you get to the foundations, if the soil is soft, the proportion is 10 to the 1 in the first floor, and if it's really, really soft, you go 18 to 1. And it was Chinese for the structural engineer. I need inches and feet, brother. Sorry, but this is how it was built. So anyway, I did the work, I did the report. There was a society called Hispanidad, and then they hired me to prepare a cycle of lectures. And the guy from Argentina, the president of this Hispanidad, and he hired me for the cycle. And he said, Donald, I only have one condition for you. What is it? By the time the lecture is done, the Spanish built the French Quarter. That was the condition. So that, okay, I'll do it. So as a consequence, how do I marry this thing of, the French, the Spanish, the Romans, and the Orleans, and the money for the work for the lecture? And I went back to those proportions of Vitruvius in the year 78 after Christ. Because the buildings in the French Quarter are built with the codes which were in existence in the 1700s, which are the old Roman codes. So they were built with the wall is 1, the next one is 2/3, the following is 2 more thirds, and the soil was very soft, so it's 16 to 1. And that's how New Orleans was built. So once in there, then the engineer understood. We got some machines to, put some numbers for them, and the house was restored. It was ready to collapse once it was used, and I wrote exactly that. It survived the renovation because there was no loads inside the building. The building was empty, but it had only construction work. But there were 5 meeting rooms, and 1 meeting room was for 180 persons.
Wow.
And the walls were built for a house. It was a family house in 1724. It was a family house, which the table was 1 and the bed, it was only for 2. If they were lucky, maybe 5 slept in the bed. And you had probably 1 armoire and 2 beds. Now, you have meeting rooms and safes and books and paper because it's the federal government. So anyway, need to say it took another 4 months to open the building and postpone everything because we have to go to heavy surgery to reinforce a lot of things. So that's my relationship about knowing how these buildings were built. But I lived in them, I walked in them, I taught in them in the regionals in Rome. And there are photographs in there which are just delicious inside some of this building, where the photo where I could have been in the French Quarter or could have been in Rome, and you would not know the difference because it's the same kind of same patterns for building. As recent as the new New Orleans Collection building across from the historic New Orleans Collection on Royal Street, we just finished the renovation and view of that building. It's a museum, really very, very nice. I have some images in here. So as recent as that, but there were some arches that the cracks were that wide.
Well.
Oh yeah, but it was still standing up. These buildings are majestic. The only building that is down is when it's down. But up above full of cracks, nothing. You just have to learn to read them. Katrina came on the 23rd and survived Katrina, a year to restore it, and then a big company in Fort Worth found me and off I went, so that's another story. But now let's go back. To understand saving, see, that's one shell square. And this is the 20th century. And this here is Royal Street. So you can see the relationship of the new century and whatever is in there. Well, most of the cities around the world used to look like this until the darn architects came. And the Bauhaus came. The Bauhaus was a movement of the end of the 1900s, and they decided to be creative in the geometrical world. So now you have a city like Mexico, Manila, Washington DC, Chicago, all of those that were not protected. And among these buildings, you have skyscrapers and porno shops and pool parlors and beauty parlors and gas stations. And that did not happen in New Orleans. But what's going to happen? So that's why most of the cities, the 20th century, really ruined cities. Because the architects came and changed the scale by putting things like those in areas like this, and they took it down and put this thing up, salute. And that's where this thing began to happen in the 20th century all around the world. But to understand why is this here and why is this here, let's start. Are you still talking to me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'll be done to move those chairs.
No, I'm fine.
Good now. So, to understand what are we saving, saving is a method, and that's easy. It's just philosophies and ethics, and then you put techniques to keep the building standing up. But first you understand what are you saving and for what. So to understand what are we saving, we have to go back. So Lloyd Wolff, here, he was a French architect, and two of his books are there, and I went to the bookshop in New Orleans last week, and I found a ghost. Lloyd died about 25 years ago, and this book was issued about 4 years ago. And it says, a young person's guide to New Orleans houses. And it has Lloyd's sketches, and it has Lloyd's drawings, which are basically extracts of the first building, the first book that he did. So I checked with some colleagues at the office, and they said, did Lloyd have a son called Lloyd? So I said, well, I don't know. I said, I just met Lloyd. But otherwise, Lloyd Wolff Ghost did this really nice, interesting one. I recommend for you to see it. You're going to see the hand of Lloyd Wolff. Really, really beautiful. And he put names on the pieces, the styles of architecture, and he had a great penmanship and great sketch abilities to do it. So really very, very nice. Lloyd Wolff is here. It's called New Orleans Houses, a House Watcher's Guide, Lloyd Wolff. So it's recommended to see it. So to do that, so Lloyd in the book introduction wrote that the city of New Orleans is one of America's greatest outdoor museums. Okay? When you go to a museum, you walk slow, and you look at the picture, and you look about a picture, and you look about a picture. But once you're in a city like New Orleans, you see a building, and there is another, and there is another. So it's basically, it's a museum where people live in the museum and in the art pieces. So that's why he called it one of the America's greatest outdoor museums. The streets are full of examples of type and styles of architecture from all over the world. Remember, New Orleans is a port. So port invites people from all over the world. So, styles of architecture from all over the world, and after some time, New Orleans developed its own unique native styles of houses. Because the climate, the snakes, the turtles, the crawfish, everything that happens in there. And New Orleans plan, this is the second rendition of the French. You can see that this is the Mississippi and they laid a city like a European city. And when this is happening is the late 1600s. And the 1600s, you still have the war, the 30 Years' War between France and England. And Europe is the history of war. They're all cousins and they hate each other, so they have family quarrels. But they just attack each other all the time. So look at New Orleans, it was going to be a fortified city with one wall, a wet moat, because they were able to get water from the river, and a second wall outside to protect New Orleans. So, protected from whom? Natives were smart. They have been here 12,000 years. You don't start a war in a swamp. The swamp will eat you. But the designer in France had no idea how the environment of New Orleans was. So a good plan that worked in France, working in New Orleans. And of course, it never happened. Pieces were started, a little bit of this wet moat was excavated. We'll have to call it, let you know why Canal Street is Canal Street name. It's called Canal because they started with a canal. And once they began to excavate the wet moat in here, it was useless, and the banks were falling down, the yellow fever, and people were not able to survive. And then the end of the French Quarter, on the north side by Lake Fortune-Tree, the limit of the French Quarter is which avenue? Rampart. What does rampart mean? Rampart in French is the wall, the city wall, is the rampart. So Rampart, Rampart Street is right here, where the rampart were supposed to be. And they built this fort, and they built this fort, and they were done in wood, because there was no bricks in New Orleans. There's no clay. But there were cypress, because all this was a complete forest. And in French, a swamp is called the Le Marais. But in New Orleans French, it's called cyprière, from cypress. So the cyprière is a forest of cypress, cyprière, in a swamp. So the whole thing was upside down from, and remember, it was 2 months between a letter written in New Orleans and somebody reading it in France, and by the time you get back, it was 5 months. So it was really a titanic effort. But nevertheless, we kept the names of that. So this is Esplanade, which was the other wet canal. Rampart Street is the boundary because the ramparts were there, the walls, and then Canal Street is here because they began to excavate the canal in there in the city. So let's go. So to understand really what this is to say, then the French Quarter was created. Well, the French Quarter is very modern because what really existed was the Vieux Carré. You know, this city was first French, then it was Spanish, then it was French, then it was Cuban, and then finally it was United States. And it's still the last land of the free today. You know, the rest of the United States doesn't know that New Orleans is still the land of the free. It's different kind of doing things, right? Like having a code for carrying or a code for the government. So you can see the bend of the Mississippi River in here, and this is on top of the Marriott Hotel, looking at Chartres Street. In here, Chartres Street. St. Louis Cathedral is there. Rampart is in the back, in here. This is the Jack's Brewery on the square, in that portion. And here is the White Elephant. And the White Elephant is the Louisiana Supreme Court. So is this thing here, you can see, is completely different from the rest of the French Quarter. Right? That's why I mentioned it, because it's coming back again. All these roofs are small, tight, inclined, high pitch, and this thing is just a white elephant, much larger than the St. Louis Cathedral in there, in that portion. This is what we see today, but snakes in the swamp, then this second proposal came to be this way. Much simplified and only the protection on the riverside because the swamp itself became better than the wall. You know, nobody walks in a swamp. You know, the turtles, alligators, and the snakes will take care of you, so why defend it? So it turned to be a second version, and all these people in here is what was called the Cyprière, which is the cypress swamp, the Cyprière. And there's a body of water, this is, the square is here, so St. Anne and St. Philip Street is here, and you can see this snakish thing happening there. That is actually biometric, because the water came all the way to the boundary of the French Quarter. And this bio was eventually filled in, and now it's Metairie Road. And a portion of this was left not covered, and that is City Park. The lagoons of City Park are original swamps in the Cyprière or New Orleans. And there was a landscape architect saving that one. And then at the end of this other street in here on St. Peter's, back there where the Opera Theater is, that street is called Basin Street, like the Basin Street Blues. Well, basin, where do you think that word comes? French word for bassin. It's the same spelling, just different sound, the bassin. And the bassin in French is the water hole for the boats to end the journey, and is the harbor. That's the basin. So the boats were able, they did not use the river because there was no motor. And the current is too fast, and the river winds, so there's never enough wind behind you to push the ships up. But they were lucky, the French, because they landed in Ocean Springs first. We are older than New Orleans. New Orleans is not gonna like that. But the French landed here. And then from here began to explore the shorelines because they're very shallow. So all these magic paintings of Ocean Springs of the French with the flag with the galleons never existed. It's just, they won the conquest war or the colonial war, so of course we were super. Have you walked in front of the yacht club? You go 3 miles and the water's to your thigh. How do you put a galleon in there? No, the galleon stayed on Ship Island because it was 17 feet deep there. That's the end of the route of the galleons, is Ship Island. Then they have the lesser rowboats or the sailboats, which were kind of, you know, for saving your life. Those were the ones that landed here in Ocean Springs because it's only 5 feet. So, they couldn't come through the river. The river has lost. The Spaniards found the mouth of the Mississippi River in about 1530s. And for 200 years, they have no idea where the Mississippi River was. They simply was lost. So the Mississippi River meanders and it changes, and it's called a delta. So there are many ways to get the water out. And by the time you're at sea, there is no river. It's just old marsh. So for the Europeans have no idea where the Mississippi River was for 200 years. But once they got to Ocean Springs and went sideways, then the natives told there was a passage into a big lake. And that's the Rigoletts. So now the French and Europeans can get to these easy waters in the Sound, sail, protect the water behind the Outer Islands, go the Rigoletts, enter Lake Pontchartrain. Now you can navigate by these shallow boats. And where do you land? You go to Lake Pontchartrain, you take Bayou St. John, and the Bayou St. John ends in Bassin Street. That was the harbor. So there are early sketches that the sailboats are here, not in the river. That's European myth because we won the war. And you see galleons in here. Until the steam appeared, there was no way to sail out of the Mississippi River. Current is very steep, and the wind is not behind you because the river goes back. So it always entered through here.
Sorry to interrupt, Donald.
Yes,
So,
please.
so why did they start the settlement there then?
Okay,
if it was not, for the river.
okay. So what happened here is that now we're gonna start now with the French Quarter or New Orleans. We're gonna start with the Vieux Carré. That's the name of the city, the Vieux Carré. Then turn the French Quarter, and the French Quarter is not New Orleans. It's only that little bit in there, and develop around Jackson Square. Here by the city, by the cathedral, which is here. Okay, so that's the beginning. Let's go. So the French, they were the ones began to do it. Well, the French were not here. The French were in Canada, and the name of Canada is not Canada. The name of Canada is Acadia. And the people from Acadia, the people, the French Americans from Acadia, are called Acadiens. And the Acadiens are the Canadian, Acadiens. And once they began to filter and they were expelled by the English and followed the Mississippi River, and they jumped out of the boat because the next stop was in the Gulf of Mexico, then they settled in the deep south of the end of the line, and then the word Acadien was corrupted to Cadien to Cajun. And then American English came and the Cajun turned into Cajun. So the Cajun is basically the Canadian French in the deep south. So they were in Acadia, in Canada, and they were concerned that the Spanish were in Cuba and the English were also surrounding in the Caribbean. So they were concerned that they're gonna, where is this river that the Spaniards saw 200 years ago? So they began to look for the river. And the way to do it is that the French were in Canada, so they were in the Great Lakes, so they were in Chicago, the deepest part, and he got two ships. Basically, they drifted down the Mississippi River. They're sailboats, but it's basically drifting down. And they came down the Mississippi River because they knew where the river was and followed it. And the first time that New Orleans was mentioned in the European history is because the Iberville, in his log book, wrote, "We saw an Indian settlement on the left bank of the river, about 20 leagues, which is 80 miles, from the mouth of the river." That's the very first instance that New Orleans began to exist as New Orleans. Now, the Indian portage had been there for 10,000 years. Because the natives had a portage because this is the river, and when you have dug out canoes, you follow the shorelines of the river, regardless of the current. And then that's Lake Pontchartrain. So this is a very narrow portage, between the river and the lake. And the lake is a whole system of rivers because from Lake Pontchartrain by boat, this is how people used to go to Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana. I-10 didn't exist. But there's a bayou that goes from Lake Pontchartrain through the, what's the name of
Lake
the other? Maurepas into the lake, and then there's a bayou, and that bayou goes all the way to Baton Rouge. Then, of course, you go out the Mississippi River, you have the Chafonca River. It was a system that the natives knew. So the natives were here already in a portage between the curve of the river and Lake Pontchartrain. So once the French saw the settlement of the natives, then they said, well, this is going to be now French territory. So it came in the 1690s is when he began to go south and became, founded the colony, and then he founded La Nouvelle Orleans in 1718. That's when officially votes and everything were done. And La Nouvelle Orleans is like New York. I went to school in York, England, and there's a city here called New York. There's a New Haven, there's a New Madrid, there's a New Moscow. So Europeans were naming cities from the Europe and the Americas, and some of them got the new. So Orleans was the Duke of Orleans, which was in power in France, and La Nouvelle, because there's an Orleans city also in France. That's where John d'Arc is. She is from Orleans. So once this was settled, then the French sent a surveyor engineer. This engineer was Adrien de Pacher. And Adrien de Pacher had already been sounding the entrance of the Mississippi River because Des Moines and Iberville, after seeing New Orleans, they continued to the mouth of the river, and now they're put it into Cartesian system. And that's how now Europeans know where the river is. Because for 200 years, they have no idea what's happening. So Adrien de Pacher had been surveying part of the Gulf and the entrance, and he was the one that was asked to design the city of New Orleans. So when he designed the city, he said honor to the royal houses. And in the time when this was happening, the Bourbons were the kings and the royal family in France. So he called the main street Bourbon Street, because the Bourbons were the family, you know, like the Queen in England. And this time the Bourbons were there, so that's why it became Bourbon Street, celebrating the royal family of France. Let's go. That's the map. Isn't that amazing? Of Adrien de Pacher. This is 1690, 1694-5 when he surveyed. And it's really interesting because this is Lake Pontchartrain. New Orleans is here. This is the river. New Orleans is here. This is Lake Bourne, different shape. The Rigolettes here, Bay St. Louis, and Ship Island, and Grass Island here. These are the Chandelier in here, and the Mississippi River keeps flowing all the way to the Delta, and look how many ways the river could come out. So that's why they couldn't see it. All these are grasslands. There are no trees. The sun shifts sides and moves, so it changes every time. And then on the other side, he probably was in love with the Germans because this is the Lac des Allemands, which means the lake of the Germans, which is much bigger than reality, than really it is, but it's there. New Iberia is someplace in here. So this is Pager is the one that did the layout, but underneath him was this Pierre Lebrun in New Orleans de la Tour. Just de la Tour is the name, but it has all this complicated name, you know, Pierre Lebrun de la Tour. And Pierre is the one that worked with Vauban, and Vauban probably was the best, most celebrated military architect in France. He established the canon of cities, the way to build the French fortifications, water systems, clean air. Why? Because he read Vitruvius, the architect of 70 after Christ, after the era of Christ, which was the Roman architect who wrote this book, Vitruvius. So he read Vauban, and it became renowned everywhere. So then, this Latour had the chance to work under this French know everything about how to implement all the new systems. The French were doing this in Manila, they did it in Haiti, they did it in Vietnam, and they did it also here in New Orleans. So let's go. So now the story really getting juicy, because it didn't last too long. New Orleans really was never intended to be a colony of France. This is beautiful, it's juicy. There's this Scot. It's just like tale of books. There's this Scot, man from Scotland. The name of this guy is John Law, L-A-W. John Law. John Law had a good ancestry and he had good money in Scotland, but he thought that London was going to be a better place to be and make more money. So he moved from Scotland to London, and in London he began to make business with the crown, in the name of the crown. He made a lot of money, began to gamble, and he had run so as to, he coined the franc, and he created the Bank of France. So this is Scotland running away probably to London, running away to France. And then he creates the franc, monetary system of France. He begins to make money, he begins to gamble, and before losing the whole thing again, he tells the king, I need a company in the Americas, part of the business. You know, you give me the grant, the permission for the company in the Americas, and I'll give you plenty of taxes to the crown. And you need the money because you're fighting the English, and you're fighting the Italian, and you're fighting all the time. So the king said, good deal. So John Law creates the Company of the West, which is a private enterprise. That's the name because he was a Scot, he spoke English. So the Company of the West is the one that actually settled in New Orleans. It was a trading place. Because now boats coming from Chicago, goods came from the Gulf of Mexico via Ship Island into New Orleans, and he begins to make money again. There are posters of beautiful New Orleans with deer and eagles and waterfalls and flowers and half-naked women like in the South Pacific, and that brought the Europeans to New Orleans. It was just posters that John Law created. And after doing all that in the Company of the West, the company did not do well because there was no gold, no ivory, no metals, no iron, no gunpowder in New Orleans. They had snakes, turtles, and crawfish. So what did John Law do? Mr. King, I think France needs a colony in the New World. I sell you the company, and France buys my company. That's why New Orleans became a colony, because John Law sold his company to the king.
Oh, my word.
Yeah, sold the company to the king. Okay? So, now the king sends the surveyor to see what was this thing that they bought. So in the 1690s, the Louisiane was established. Louisiane is not New Orleans. La Louisiane is this.
Oh, word.
That's the Louisiane. That is what actually became, through John Law, the Company of the West. This is another map. This is a map when La Louisiane was charted. This naked here are the Rocky Mountains. So this is early 1700s, and somehow beautiful drawing, to be able to cover this enormous territory on horseback and sextant with the stars. So what happened is that this became La Louisiane in here, and that's what the French owned. But the king needed the money. He was fighting the English and Italians and the Germans and care less about this thing. So once the king figured out that there's no gold, no ivory, no money, but now the colony, which is colony, needs a church and a hospital and buildings, the king says, happy birthday, my dear cousin. His cousin was the king of Spain. Happy birthday, here, I'm giving you La Louisiane, because you're my good cousin. And that's how that territory went to Spanish hands. Because the king was just spending money, not getting back, and he saw the opportunity to give it to the cousin, give it to the Spanish. So, by the time it was established in 1690s, 1718 is the cornerstone of founding New Orleans in 18. He began improvised huts and building, really disorganized. And fortunately enough, in 1722, there's a big hurricane and demolished like 80% of the huts in New Orleans. So that created the French Quarter, because once the hurricane demolished whatever huts and layouts it was just improvised, then that drawing from the Latour appeared, so he was able to put a city grid because there were no houses left. And then began to put that one and that created the streets of New Orleans. So that was after 1722 hurricane. In 1763, then is when happy birthday, dear cousin, and he went to Spain. So Spain has now that territory from New Orleans, and the Spains had Latin America, the Philippines, West Africa, they lots of gold in South America, silver in Mexico, and New Orleans had turtles and crawfish and snakes. So what the Spanish do, my dear cousin, happy birthday. And meanwhile, the first cousin had died, so the next cousin was alive, which is at that time became the King of France, and said, happy birthday, my dear friend, I'm giving you La Louisiane. So that's why New Orleans came back to France. But at that time, people in New Orleans already liked the place. It was the land of the free. Now you have the French telling what to do and the Spanish what to do. So believe it or not, New Orleans became independent as a republic. I'm not inventing this. It's all written in the book. This whole section, all this is New Orleans in here. Okay? So New Orleans becomes independent as a republic. We're not going to be under French. We're not going to be under the darn Spanish. We are going to be New Orleans. When the King of Spain hears that New Orleans is now a republic independent, sends a note to the governor of Cuba. And the name of the governor in Cuba was O'Reilly, which is an Irishman, working for the Spanish crown. So orders of O'Reilly is, finish this rebellion in New Orleans, you know, we have no patience for these people. So O'Reilly organizes a trip, brings some soldiers from Cuba, land in New Orleans, and it's the massacre of O'Reilly.
Oh.
It's written in New Orleans Annals. The massacre of O'Reilly. 3 were killed. 3. The leaders of the revolution. But you have to create propaganda, so you write, right? So the massacre of New Orleans. And that was the end of the New Orleans Republic. So now it's under Spanish control from Cuba by an Irishman.
Wow.
And France is now again the owner of that. And France has no patience with this, no money, is fighting the war, and Napoleon is in charge. So Thomas Jefferson appears. And Thomas Jefferson appears because Benjamin Franklin has been in France. And Franklin told Jefferson, let's buy Cuba, let's invade Cuba. Because if we invade Cuba, we control the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico. And if we control the Gulf of Mexico, we control the Mississippi River, and we control that. So Jefferson liked that and authorized the Louisiana Purchase. So now, in the hands of France. So again, 1763, happy birthday, Spanish King. 1800, happy birthday, French King. 1803, now the paper signed that it went back to the transfer of power to France. And in 1803, 3 weeks later, after France received this, United States buys La Louisiane. So on December 29th, the USA buys that. They have no idea how big this thing was. Okay? Let's go. So, the Louisiana Purchase occurs. With the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson is now leading this thing of buying this territory. And who did he guys or ask to do the transaction? Pierre Samuel DuPont. So the DuPont fortune of all these chemicals, rubber industry, the big DuPonts are everywhere, starts with business as the French working for Jefferson to sell the Louisiana. So then, in 1803, then in the new republic, in the 29th is already done, but it basically was a Thomas Jefferson idea to buy that enormous territory. And the transaction was $15 million US, which is about 3 cents an acre on that territory. That gave all of this other part of the United States. Basically, more than double the 13 colonies into La Louisiana. And that's the day in New Orleans, in front of the cathedral. This is the Spanish cathedral. This is the Cabildo, and the Presbyterians on the other side. And down goes the French flag, and up on the United States. So that is when the Louisiana Purchase occurred. Okay? Let's go. French Quarter was built with what? There's no clay, there's no sand, there's no clean water, but there were plenty of La Cyprière, there were plenty of cypress trees. So New Orleans basically was built of wood, because that's what they had. And what they really did with wood was those shakes, and the roots were all wood shingles. There's no Spanish tile, there's no clay, right? So wood shingles. And the posts of the cypress board were sunken into the dirt in New Orleans, put a lattice of little branches, got the mud, and plastered the wall with mud between the posts. That is called colombage in French. And as the time went and the rains occurred, then all this mud began to disintegrate because it's humid, it's rainy, so they began to use brick in between the wood posts. And that's some surviving things in New Orleans, and it's called the briquette entre posts. The post. Post is post from French. So this is New Orleans. And in 1888, you have the Great Fire. This is the church, Rampart, Canal Street, and the fire started here. So it's Good Friday. I like this story. Good Friday. When I was a kid in Guatemala, so far away like the rest of the Christian world, on a Good Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the Christ died, it was silent. No bells, no horns, no noise. The world stopped. And I remember that. It was really eerie. No sound, no noise, because the Christ is dead. Bells were used to alarm the people when there was an enemy, when there was an event. You called the attention of the whole town or throughout Europe, ringing the bells. Well, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the lady has an altar with candles, because it's Good Friday, and the curtains caught fire because it had candles. So the fire began to travel sideways. Soon you have, the wood shingles and thatch. The fires start, and they go to tell that there's a fire going there in several houses. And it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So suddenly, are we going to lose more houses, or are we going to lose our soul? Because we have to ring the bells on Good Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Christ died. Guess who won? Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ won. The bells were not ringing. So people down here did not know there was a fire coming. And you can see where the wind was coming, because the fire started here and began to do that. So Jesus Christ won, no bells, no warning, and it's in the book. So when that happened, the Spanish were already in control, and they saw, they had experience in the Caribbean with hot weather, experience in North Africa with very hot weather, dry. So once the fire occurred, then the Spanish officials wrote codes. This is for you, the early codes. And the codes from the Spanish was that the walls, the heck with the wood and the cyprier, the wall had to be of thick brick. And here is where all these comments I made to you about Vitruvius and Roma and the other architects doing proportions. Thick brick walls with parapets. The wall went above the roof. And you see that in the orange architecture. So if the house catches fire, it stays within the tall walls and it doesn't jump to the other houses. That's the Spanish technique to control the fire, with the parapet. And then because it was hot, then suddenly arcades were mandated because it rained in New Orleans and it's hot. So now you have arcades in front of the buildings, and that's where the wrought iron began to appear. You have a balcony, you need a rail. So that began to do that what Spanish codes about how to do. And the new buildings had to be done where, like the Spanish, the big ones, San Luis Cathedral, the Cabildo, and the Presbytery. And the Cabildo burned in the second fire, and the cathedral as well, because the fire went through there. So the original French and the Presbytery survived, which is here, but the Cabildo burned. Let's go. That's not, So, this can be Atlanta, Singapore, Melbourne, Chicago, Mexico. But you do not see those in here, which is what happened around the world. They began to demolish the traditional city to put that in here. So something happened here that kept all this 20th century that side. Because somebody saw there was value in this lesser architecture here. Grand of the day, but lesser by now. So that is here, Canal Street. And Canal Street is not the border, it's the street before, which is called Iberville. Iberville is the end of the French Quarter on the port side. On the other side of Iberville is Canal. So now that is all in Canal Street. So something happened here that stopped that, and the rest of the world didn't do this. The rest of the cities are a mess everywhere. Let's go. So these were some of the early buildings that still survive in New Orleans from the French time because they were out of the fire. So one is the blacksmith house that is still in the corner of St. Anne and just north of Bourbon Street. So here you can see this is wood posts with brick in between and wood shingles. So New Orleans, French New Orleans looked like that. That was the scale of the town. Then is Madame John's Legacy on the main, which looks almost like a plantation house, because that's what the French knew in Panama, in Haiti, in Guadeloupe, in the Dominique. And you can see how different it became when the Spanish appeared, because the Spanish began to do this much taller building with the brick walls and the parapet. And this is one of the few French examples that still survive. This is the original drawing for the cathedral, in the French cathedral, St. Louis, that burned in the first fire, because it was in wood and fusillage, and because it's in the mud, the French didn't know what to do. You can see the cathedral had to have props on both sides with wood, because the thing was dancing. And this is the Ursuline convent in wood frame, very much the French way of the 1600s, how to build. So this is all wood because they have plenty in New Orleans, and then mud between all that wood. And that is what happens inside of this one here, which is the Ursuline convent. Another story. This survived because it's brick, but there's no brick in New Orleans. Okay? No clay, no brick. There's another clever guy in Ocean Springs. And Ocean Springs comes and goes to the nuns and goes to the governor, and it says, if you give me the contract, I'll give you 450,000 bricks, so that the Orleans will not burn again. At the price, but I'll give you the bricks. So of course they have lost the city 2-3 times to fire. They pay. this new entrepreneur price for 450,000 bricks. Who was the guy and what were they made? They were making golf hills because they found clay there. The buyer was in Golf Hills. You can get the sailboats from Golf Hills through the rivulets to New Orleans. So they had kilns and the clay in Golf Hills. And the name of the guy who began to supply the materials is Moran. They still have a lumber yard. And they still have real estate. So this is how things are made in the new colonies, right? So, but this is the original 1700 of the, one of the few ones about in New Orleans. Let's go. So, once the Spaniards appeared, building grew instantly high, much cooler to live. The hot air is there instead of the cottages or cabins of the French because they came from Normandy. And in Normandy, they don't have those buildings. They're not even hot. So in Normandy, you have small cottages, thatch roofs to keep the cold air out. But in New Orleans, it didn't work. But the Spanish have been in the Caribbean for 200 years, so they came. So those images in here can be Panama, can be Portobello, can be Puerto Rico, San Juan. You know, this pattern repeats. You have been in some of them. But once they had the tall buildings and you have the galleries, because you needed to protect the wall from the heat and the sun, then this wrought iron came to be. And that became the Orleans. You can see that this here faces where the sun is not brutal. This one here faces where the sun is very hot. Because now you have the ferns actually acting as curtains to shade the balcony, but that's where you sleep and that's where you entertain because it's too hot. So the gallery became this romance because it was that one, and it started with two buildings, the Fontalba building on Jackson Square. It was the first woman that actually was able to own buildings probably in the New World, in North America. The Baroness of Fontalba, she wore slacks and pants and she did her thing and built the Fontalba buildings. And then of course she had to use the galleries and everybody became part of the fashion. In New Orleans they had to be dressed with all this beautiful lace. But the reason is not only be beautiful, is that you cover the wall for the sun. You have shade and you can hang shade in front of your houses. All these are cultural values. This is what developers do not see. They want the money. And other parts of the world, they demolish this to put something new because they understand cultural value. New Orleans was living this way. Let's go. So here is more of what is New Orleans. And that's, you know, the plaque in the street in La Calle de Bourbon, you know, which is Bourbon Street. And then it said from 1762 to 1803, this name, the street named this thing, which is when the Spanish were in Louisiana, in here. And notice that this is Spanish a la French, and this is Spanish a la French. This originally wasn't there. So you have the Cabildo and the Presbytere like that. And that building can be in Cuba, can be in Vietnam, and in Saigon, so they were there too. But once the Americans came, they didn't want to be Spanish, they'd rather be French, then they put a mansard on top. Now it looks more French. And the cathedral was in really bad shape and almost needed to be demolished. So in the American Times came and then arranged a little bit of the Spanish thing by turning French Gothic to have more of the French villages here. And of course then the fronts and the colors and the view on the Orleans became this unique thing. There isn't in any other way. Let's go. Remember that white elephant in the map so big? Well, what happened is that New Orleans was a big city, entrance to all of the United States through the Mississippi. So Louisiana needed a courthouse. So in 1909, they completed this white elephant, and they got these architects to design this. Did they ask for a local architect? No. It's the federal government. Remember the civil engineer for the house in New Orleans was from Denver? Well, they hired this architect from Atlanta to put it in this French pastiche, because now they have French, American, Spaniards, and the Caribbean people all living together. There were 4 languages in the French Quarter. So they get this architect from Atlanta, and they design that. White marble, big, no galleries, curve, and the people in New Orleans really got insulted. Not only looks like this, but to build this, they demolished 4 city blocks of French Quarter. There is a alley on each side of the building that's interrupted, and there used to be another cross road in front of this thing. So they demolished 4 blocks of French Quarter to put this. So this began to infuriate the people. You know, we don't need these foreign architects to begin to destroy our city. They don't understand what we are living in here. So this one here, when it was, as Nate said, became an unwelcome eyesore. You can read over and over about this white elephant. Believe it or not, it's one of the reasons the French Quarter was safe. Because once the local began to see this is what the modern world is going to look like, we don't need the modern world in here. They're going to destroy it, you know? So this became to be the seed of what to do in here. The Americans came, they have their own city hall, the gallery hall at the other side of Canal Street. Now the American live in the American sector, which is upriver for New Orleans, the French, on the Garden District, Gallery Hall, Jackson Square, and the French and Creoles and Spaniards live in the French Quarter. And in New Orleans, we do not have medians. You know what a median is in the street, right? A median is that garden thing that engineers put it between 2 roadways in the street to put a piece of garden with trees. That is called the median everywhere. But in New Orleans, it's called
St. Charles.
what? No.
Oh, St. Charles Street.
Yeah, but they have that. That's in there.
Neutral ground.
The neutral ground. Well, it is not a city that has neutral grounds, because the Americans did not understand the French and the Creoles and the Spanish in the French Quarter. In the French Quarter, who understand the Martians who live on the other side of Canal Street, so they created the neutral ground. So Canal Street became the neutral ground between the Americans and the leftovers of the Europeans. It was like the Venus and Martians, different languages and everything. The Americans pass out of Canal Street, oh, those bums in the French Quarter, they drink, they have siesta, they have Mardi Gras, they have funny laws, and then the other ones in the French Quarter, those gringos work all the time, they only think about money, they don't have a good joy of life. So, 2 words. So, Canal Street is the neutral ground. So, when all this thing was happening, it really went down the quarter, because most of the whites and what-to-do left the quarter and began to move into the Garden District. So the quarter deflated. And when this deflates, then you get whoever wants to rent something. It basically became slums. The new immigrants lived in the quarter. The Sicilians, the Puerto Ricans, you know, the Latin Americans. So it became a Bohemian quarter. So once you have Bohemians, you have artists, you have good music, you don't care about expensive wine, you just want wine, and you know, live well, and you have the traditions to do it. So this became active part of the Bohemia, and they saw these new architects wanting to do more of this in the French Quarter. And they said, no way. So they started basically an internal revolution against the architects and the governors of Louisiana wanting to modernize New Orleans. This all with the women. All with the women. And in preservation without the women, nothing would be saved in the world. The women have done the job of being the preservation. So there is a woman that began to organize New Orleans that it needs to be protected. It began to fight City Hall and the governor to the system. situation is happening in Charleston, South Carolina. So New Orleans had already, by laws written, discussed, but they didn't get organized because New Orleans is New Orleans, and Charleston got able to get organized. And in 1929, Charleston took the idea from New Orleans and they created the historic district of Charleston. That's why Charleston is saying the old Charleston. So now New Orleans said, oh, we could have been first. So it took from 29 to 33 to finally get the French Quarter protected because it was going to be transformed into that. So in 1925, sorry, the Vieux Carré Commission was created, and again, here is a woman to be that. Once this is approved in 36, the Louisiana Constitution gets amended to consider French Quarter a cultural asset. Finally, legislation is beginning to work in order that. And then by the 1940s, there's already enough power to prevent demolition further in the French Quarter. So let's go. Charleston. We could have been the first in New Orleans, but we were the second because the way that the laws and everything. But Charleston had very much the same character. The southern port, it's not, they don't have the French and the Caribbean. They have more of the Northern European. So this can be, if you have been in Stockholm, this is the street in Stockholm. The colors, the scale, the parapets. So this is Charleston on King Street here. So this was safe because somebody put a limit in a piece of paper and said, inside the circle, you have to ask permission to do anything. And that is what said Charleston. And just like New Orleans, Charleston started also like a walled city. This is the entrance to the Atlantic here, and these are the two rivers in that Charleston. Very much like New Orleans, and very much like that. So they got it, and again, another woman in charge of this. Susan Pringle Frost was the one that spearheaded all this movement to make Charleston protected. And she said, now is the time, tomorrow is too late. In Ocean Springs, we're a little bit in there. Right? Yeah. I think we are ready tomorrow in Ocean Springs.
Yeah.
So let's go. Well, but things are easy in New Orleans? No. The 1960s come, the highway system is invented. The engineers decide that they need a highway to go in the riverfront to connect with I-10 coming to Mississippi here. This is the bridge in 10. This is the French Quarter. And that's Jackson Square. So this proposal for engineer was to build a two-story roadway with the foundations where Café du Monde is, and then have the traffic up above. So again, another battle for New Orleans. Because now it's the federal government doing this highway system. So you're not fighting the governor of Louisiana, you're fighting Washington. So this began a really big movement in New Orleans, and you can see this poster envisioning this new system like an octopus engulfing over New Orleans, with the tentacles of that one in there. So this was another big fight. So this united more the preservationists in New Orleans when the whole French Quarter from the riverfront was going to be torn out, and this portion in here is actually Elysian Fields. This is Esplanade, so it is Elysian Fields. So all this was going to be now look like any part of the United States near the Superway. So that was a big movement. Having to do that, fighting this, they went to Washington. We have powerful senators in Louisiana, and they created a National Historic Landmark. Now there are commissions in all the historic towns throughout the United States. But this became the very first tool, the National Historic Landmark, that the whole quarter is now a landmark, worth preserving. So they have better tools. And then in 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act became in play. That was Johnson. And then in 69, God finally go into Washington and get that thing annulled. No more fight for this person. So that was another big, big battle. Let's go. Then after that, there's no threat for the river walk, and then for the, the front of the river needs to be there, and now New Orleans is being discovered by the big enterprises hotels. Now they want to put that, not in the quarter, they want it in the quarter, but now the quarter is protected. No big buildings inside the quarter. But Iberville, this side is to protect the French Quarter, the other side is not. So I have to tell you that all this big push with big money with the politicians, Marriott Hotel, the Sheraton Hotel, all of those are facing canal on the back is Iberville on the French Quarter. So that created now that photo where you see the quarter, the big tower in the back. And this is just on the other side of canal when all these hotels, big push for tourism began in the United States. I mean, in New Orleans. And then by 1984, you have the World's Fair. So now the world knows about New Orleans having the fair, which began to bring more people, which needed more hotels. So what happened is that there's another fight in the city of New Orleans and the preservation and in the Duke River Commission to not allow these big things happening in the quarter because they have money and politicians are glutton for that. So they passed ordinances that will not be able to have those, but there's always a way down, so the timeshares in the bed and breakfast got underneath. So now we have the street hotels throughout the quarters, but we don't have the big things. Let's go. So, we went from 300 years of all this incredible story of New Orleans. So right now, in the Historic New Orleans collection, every building in the quarter has been measured, photographed, mapped. Is in a digital survey, and each color represents the use, the age, the work, the condition have to be done. You have to go through permitting in different layers to be able to stay within those boundaries. And this complete survey, which is now sponsored by the family Collins people, it's all housed in the New Orleans collection. And the New Orleans collection is located here, and now they own several buildings in the quarter, and they bought the one across the street, which is this one here. So this is the region, this is Royal Street in here. This is the original Rulatur house. It was a wine merchant built with a Spanish roof. Soon we began to see that it leaked, so they put an inclined roof with Spanish tiles. And the original galleries are still there. The oldest gallery in New Orleans is still here. And the three quarters have been demolished because Channel 6 television was here in the back. So they have metal structures because that's what the television studios were. So they gave that job to us. The office I collaborated in New Orleans, Wagon and Ball. So we took the challenge. We had to restore this house that had converted into 9 different apartments and 3 shops. And then artists lived in the courtyard, and that was the leftovers of the television studio. So this was not original, and the collection needed exhibit rooms. So if you have been in the New Orleans collection recently, you walk through the courtyard, you enter a new building with high galleries where the exhibits are, and then this thing on top is where all the air conditioning exists, so that it cannot be seen from any place. It's all embedded in here, and then the house. So entering through the main corridor, through here, this is what you see. This is the original gallery, and the original gallery, that's where the television studios were, and that's the new museum. So these windows are tinted for the sun, but reflects the entrance of here. So it's like seeing the building that originally was there, before the television, the noise done in the sixties. And now there's a courtyard, a little cafe, we find a well in here. Really was really great experience to be there, but it wasn't bad shape. There were cracks, not wide in the arches. So you can visit that in New Orleans. It's exactly across the street from the old, the collection across the street. And they have events all the time. There's films, festivals, etc., which is really going to be a great job to be done. But that's a tremendous tool now in preservation. Many cities in the world now follow this idea of New Orleans to charter everything into and now digital. It started with drawing and now it's all digital. So let's go. So now you understand why there is a wall at the end of the French Quarter. But that saved New Orleans. At the other side of Canal Street, there were warehouses when New Orleans was a harbor. And then all these stevedores and all these storage and warehouses died because now we use containers. And the port of New Orleans is not in New Orleans any longer, it's on the Industrial Canal. That's where the container ships come. And so there were all these great warehouses that were redundant, they were empty. So in Julia Street, the circle, we began to transform those into apartments. And then Pointers was the places for the big warehouses, and that was allowed more to be said. Thank you.
Wow. Wonderful as always, thank you.
Go.
Now, I'd like to point out maybe three things culturally when you're in New Orleans.
Watch your eyes, watch your eyes.
On this,
Yes?
picture right here, when you take a walk into it, it's kind of interesting. First off, this building right here, you'll notice it's taller from the ground floor, if you're standing out here looking at it, to this point right here. So when this building was built, this a merchant built it, and he sold his goods down here, but between the ceiling in the store and the floor where his family lived on this side was about a 4-foot void, and that's where he kept his inventory.
That's called the entresol.
Right.
When you walk in the audience, you see the entrance to the shops, which are wood, but the arches on top of the doors, they have iron grill. They were protecting the goods of the inventory of the shop.
And another thing too, from the standpoint of supporting the building when it began to deteriorate, you'll notice pins a lot of times here and here and here with rebar. It looks like rebar, but it's not. It's just a long bolt that goes from here to the back of the building, and they screw it in and put a support here and up here as well.
No, they're like girdles, they have to keep the buildings together with this pin.
Right.
Yeah.
And then one other thing that's really kind of interesting, in some of the buildings when you're walking through, you will see a plate on the front. It's like a brass plate, sometimes it's a metal plate, and there's a number on it. But if you're walking along and you look at it, you say, well, that's not, the number's like maybe 75. And you'll say, that's not 75 Raw Street, I'm in the 600 block. What it is the insurance plaque, bronze plate. So if there was a fire, well, what you would do is you pay the fire department for this plaque, and they stick it on your building. And if there was a fire in your building, and this is way before the fire department started, they'd pull up, and if you didn't have a plaque on your building, they'd leave.
That's
Because
not
you
this
hadn't
big.
paid,
You hadn't paid the insurance.
you hadn't paid the insurance. So, anyway.